So again, thank you everyone for joining us. I thought that I'd explain a little bit about what how we came about having this particular opportunity, and then a little bit about some of the organisation and some ideas moving forward before I talk about my topic for today, which is my perspective. And there are many different perspectives, of course, in the tinnitus area, but my perspectives on tinnitus therapy yesterday, today, and tomorrow, uh, with an overview, but obviously a slight bias and perspective in coming from my particular worldview as an audiologist and looking at sound therapy in particular. So a little bit about this. We know that there are quite a few different networks around the world in the tinnitus area that people can belong to, and some of these have regular meetings and opportunities for people to connect and to participate in. In Australia and New Zealand, we haven't had any, at least as far as I'm aware, network at the academic and clinical level where we can really readily share ideas and make connections and network. Of course, with the COVID pandemic, we have learned a lot about the use of Zoom and connections and how interconnected we actually are. So we're really taking this opportunity to give a talk. Alicia and Mike, thank you for helping out getting this all started. Also to Megan at the Esdale Moore Centre for facilitating the communications around this. So the idea was to really create an opportunity for people interested in tinnitus or interested in particular topics in Australia and New Zealand to connect. It's not meant to be an exclusive group. As I mentioned before, great to see Glenys from Canada joining us very late in the evening there. And we encourage people to really let people know about these events as we have. And if people just want to come in on individual talks that are of interest, or they would like to be part of a informal network, by all means, and we'll see where that goes. The idea is that it will be a mix of clinical and research, Australia, New Zealand. I suppose potentially we may also have guest speakers from overseas if we can get the timing right. Just for those in the Big Island, this is New Zealand over here. All right. And I'm based at the University of Auckland in a part of the Isdale Moore Centre, which incorporates many of the researchers in hearing and balance in New Zealand in a shared vision based out of a centre that's at the University of Auckland. And this is a picture of the building that I'm based. I'm actually giving my talk right at the moment from somewhere here on the second floor. This building is so new that this is a virtual artist's impression of what the building will look like. But this has become the home of where my research is based, and it's also where Megan and the team looking after the administration of the Isdale Moore Centre is based as well. The Isdale Moore Centre is named after an eminent New Zealand otolaryngologist, Sir Patrick Isdale Moore, who really began hearing research in New Zealand and was an inspiration to many researchers developing over the years. It's a virtual centre in which we hope to get people with diverse interests across hearing and balance to cooperate, look to collaborate, join forces with industry and so on to help grow clinical research and basics research. enable that translation through to practice. So Megan and the team have agreed to help out with the logistics around some of these talks. So I thought I'd start out a little bit about talking about tinnitus in New Zealand and the information that we have. And this is actually taken from data that Roy Morgan surveys undertook. This was in the early 2010s, where a number of individuals were surveyed and asked the question whether they experienced tinnitus and for what period of time. And I suspect this data is fairly similar to that in Australia, but there are probably some cultural differences which are interesting. So what do we find from this? Well, around about 6.5, between 5 and 6% of the population experience chronic tinnitus, which is on the low end of self-reported tinnitus in the population if we look at overseas studies, but we believe that that relates to the question that was used in acquiring this data. We see that as we age, we're more likely to experience tinnitus, and if we look at the over 65 age group, we see it's a very high percentage of that group that actually experiences tinnitus. And of course, for many of us, we're living in aging populations. And so this becomes very much an important consideration for health planning generally, but also within the hearing health workforce. Wealth doesn't seem to differentiate the prevalence of tinnitus. There are some regional distributions across New Zealand. Wellington has the highest percentage population from a few percentage points. For those in Australia, Wellington is our capital city. So you might expect that in Canberra, with all the politicians, that there'd also be a higher percentage of tinnitus, possibly just because of all the hot air. It's interesting that Auckland here has a lower prevalence of tinnitus rather than these regions. And that possibly reflects the cultural and ethnic diversity of this city, with a high proportion of non-New Zealand Europeans within the city. And if we have a look at prevalence outside of New Zealand Europeans, we see that tinnitus reporting is quite low amongst the Maori population, which is counter to most health statistics where Maori are normally overrepresented. We don't know why this is at the moment, and it could be a reflection of the survey rather than, in fact, a true prevalence. And we're undertaking some Maori-led research in the area of hearing healthcare to try and understand from a Maori perspective better about health services access. And one of the flow-on projects, hopefully that will result from that, will be an understanding of Maori perspectives on tinnitus as well. So past, when does past begin and when does present begin is a bit of a conundrum to consider, but here we have a few past treatments. Cockroaches ground in rose oil, earthworms boiled in goose grease and inserted in the ear, fumigation of the ear by urine of ox with vinegar and myrrh. Now, just to point out, again, to our Australian guests and those outside of New Zealand, these are not mainstream New Zealand treatments for tinnitus. And it's interesting here that if we consider in the Middle Ages that tinnitus was likely fairly highly prevalent at a younger age associated with middle ear or regional ear infections, this might be due actually have
limited number of parents and some sort of rubbish about that.
Just those that have got their microphones on, if you could just turn those off, please. Thanks very much. So potentially vinegar has an antiseptic effect, that might have some beneficial effects for external ear infections.
I'm just going to put it on TV
middle ear infections.
What they choose to put in them.
And The myrrh was probably to cover up the smell of the urine of ox. What the actual pharmacokinetics of urine of ox is on tinnitus, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps some of those with a pharmacy background can perhaps inform us the potential effect of that. Of course, in the Middle Ages, various treatments were tried for tinnitus, including boring holes in the skull to let out evil vapors, and cupping was also used. Now, people still use cupping, particularly in the form of dry cupping, in which a heated glass jar is placed often on the back, and this is in some ways a replacement for acupuncture. Wet cupping, which was used in the Middle Ages, an incision was made, and then the cup was used to draw blood from the individual. Probably if we instigated these in clinics today, the prevalence of tinnitus in the community would drop dramatically, and we'd find that we actually had fewer patients, but we can't necessarily claim greater success rates. Jean-Marie Gaspard Attard in the late 1700s, with case studies, began to make observations of the effect of sound on tinnitus. So the observation that the sound of wind, tinnitus that sounded like wind could be covered by a roaring fire, that the sound of different wood on the fire could have an effect on different types of tinnitus sound. Water falling from a vase, fountains and the like could have an effect on tinnitus, and observations that a person moved to live in a watermill because they obtained relief from their tinnitus. Many ways, tinnitus masking is really an electronic form of these older treatment. Up until the 1990s, the possibility of auditory nerve section was there for tinnitus treatment. And in the early 80s, there was the promise that if you were to cut the auditory nerve in very severe cases of tinnitus, you might prevent transmission of a signal from the inner ear through to the brain, and therefore essentially cut off tinnitus at its source. Unfortunately, what we know, but fortunately which has led to discoveries in the area of the role of the brain in tinnitus, is that in many people, sectioning, cutting the auditory nerve did not have the desired effect of reducing tinnitus. In many cases, the tinnitus remained or became worse, but of course, hearing was removed, and so the tinnitus was heard in isolation from any other competing sound, compounding the effect of tinnitus on the individual. This is no longer seen as an ethical treatment, but of course there are some cases where the auditory nerve is sectioned because of removal of tumours. And we still get the situation where an individual may have tinnitus and the absence of sound coming into the ear. And this offers a research opportunity to understand tinnitus. And Mike Maslin, one of the colleagues here in New Zealand, has been doing some work on that area, which is something that we might like to hear in a future presentation. So present or past, where do you draw the line on what is present and what is past? And are some of the things that we, in fact, undertake now actually passé and should be replaced? That's an argument, and where I draw the line here is somewhat academic. But I thought I'd put up here a modern approach to set the scene for some of the discussions that I'll consider following up. So the basis that at the moment there is no sure cure, there is no silver bullet for tinnitus. Typically, we would want to take a very complete clinical history, and through that and an otological examination and audiometry would understand the contributions of hearing and other potential medical contributors to the tinnitus perception. Tinnitus pitch and loudness evaluation may be valuable for characterizing the tinnitus, and certainly in some of the treatments that are described, pitch measurement is necessary because treatments are based in and around that particular measurement. Understanding environmental factors that can contribute to the individual's tinnitus, whether this is because they are isolating themselves from outside sounds or because there are stresses in their environment that are aggravating tinnitus perception and the effects of tinnitus on the individual, or the degree to which they are attending to their tinnitus. Blood tests. Now, this is not necessarily related to tinnitus specifically, but as I'll mention later on, there is the promise of this, but blood tests potentially to evaluate other medical problems that may be contributing to tinnitus. Again, also assessing physiological function with regard to the jaw, head and neck problems, potentially blood pressure. These are all things that we would hope in a comprehensive evaluation an otolaryngologist would consider. Determination of diet and lifestyle factors. While generally people don't place a great weight on prescribing a particular diet to an individual, and past recommendations from about caffeine have somewhat fallen aside, obviously a healthy lifestyle and ensuring that a person has a healthy diet can be recommended. Identifying emotional factors contributing to the tinnitus, either as triggers for the perception or the maintenance of the tinnitus sound itself, is really important. And any clinician should be offering sympathetic understanding and counselling in and around the emotional and stress-related factors contributing to tinnitus. And one way that we can do that is to provide good information to take away the mystery of the tinnitus. And of course, with today's availability of information on the internet and so on, making sure that people have got a very sound understanding and access to very reliable sources of information, and providing them with some health literacy in and around accessing the internet and other sources of information. It could be argued that the most effective treatment for tinnitus is to cure any deafness. Now, the assumption here is that most people with tinnitus will have some degree of ear pathology. And of course, we're understanding or beginning to understand the role of hidden hearing loss or various forms of deafferentation that possibly do not show up in the audiogram. And so the presence of a normal audiogram does not indicate the presence of no ear pathology with tinnitus. I think most clinicians would also agree it's very important to treat each patient as an individual. And this is a great emphasis for research moving forward. And in fact, when we do come to my perspective of the future, a lot of it is devoted to the individual measurements and personalised care for the individual tinnitus. And I suppose the last aspect of it is really the positive messaging that we really want to give everybody that has tinnitus, rather than saying you simply have to learn to ignore tinnitus or that there is nothing that can be done, which often leads to people experiencing a great level of despair, is that we can really say that there are opportunities to look at various things. We never want to say that nothing can be done. So really, this is a synopsis of a modern approach to tinnitus management. And of course, the interesting thing about this is it comes from 1948. And so Edmund Prince Fowler was an esteemed American otolaryngologist through the late 1930s and post-war period. In many ways, set up what we do now for tinnitus assessment, counselling, psychological management, use of hearing aids, and also investigation of masking as it relates to tinnitus. Now, while a lot of the terms that we used at this particular time we would no longer use, essentially the building blocks are present there. And so when I think about the present, I'm not just thinking about 2021, I'm really thinking about the post-war period. We have learned an awful lot since then and a lot of details, but I think the real promise is what we're learning at the moment in its application to future therapies. So hearing aids began to be used essentially as soon as we really got to quality situation as far as the development of technology. And of course, development of transistors in the early 1950s rapidly led to development in hearing aids for tinnitus. Initially, this was primary for individuals who had otosclerosis, and it was very successful in managing that. How hearing aids work? Well, they're presumed to improve communication, potentially reduce attention to the tinnitus, may reduce auditory gain, but there are a number of other potential mechanisms. Hearing aids have become important tools in various sound therapies, such as tinnitus retraining therapy, along with the use of other sound, as well as counselling. And I guess that while the section here and some of my following dialogue is in and around the use of sound therapy, in no way am I advocating its current clinical use in isolation from other therapy components, including psychological therapies. But disclaimer here, this largely reflects my own interest, and so I'm going to be talking about that and focusing on that. Now, the trouble with this is, although hearing aids have a weight of evidence, there are a large number of studies, relatively large number of studies supporting the use of hearing aids. Most of those studies are of low level quality evidence, and that there have been few well-controlled randomized control trials in this area. It's difficult to actually undertake such trials in tinnitus using hearing aids when it comes to blinding. But it has been limiting in the recommendations. We see that hearing aids generally are included in clinical guidelines, particularly when it's tinnitus is accompanied by hearing loss. But there isn't a great deal of high-level evidence for the use of tinnitus. I'm going to refer to this cricket as a visual metaphor or analogy for tinnitus throughout the talk here. Just an aside, I had one patient who was a really quite amusing fellow who was convinced that he had a cricket that was following him around his house one summer. And it was only when he was fishing in the middle of the Hauraki Gulf out here in Auckland, and he looked around his little fishing boat that he realised that there wasn't a cricket there, and it was something within his head. So I'm going to use this as an analogy, but in the context of background sound. So the picture behind the cricket represents an auditory scene. In this case, a lot of the high frequency energy has been taken out of the visual image, and this is meant to represent a high frequency hearing loss. And the story goes, if we provide a hearing aid, we actually boost the auditory environment, and the contrast between the cricket and the background environment is reduced. So tinnitus and hearing aids for tinnitus may not effectively change the cricket sound, but it does raise the level of competition against that particular perception within the head. I'm going to be challenging this view a little bit with another presentation later on, looking at other ways that hearing aids may actually interfere with the tinnitus perception. But this would be the general held view. Masking, aside from the use of environmental sounds, really became possible in the mid-1970s, and the first hearing aid-based masker became available in the early 1980s, late 1970s, and patented in 1980 by Jack Vernon out of Oregon. Now, this became very popular very quickly, and the goal at its beginning was to effectively cover or replace the tinnitus perception with a more pleasant sound. So generally it required a fairly high level of sound from these devices to totally cover the tinnitus. Really, within about 5 years, it was found that for individuals, covering the tinnitus in its entirety was quite difficult, and that a partial masking became quite effective. So a lower level of sound, not trying to cover up the tinnitus, but to have a competing sound that would take away some of the overall emphasis that the tinnitus had in the individual's auditory scene, and also to provide a level of relief or control for the individual over their tinnitus. Now, again, as with hearing aids, low-level evidence to support masking as a therapy. And within clinical guidelines, it's believed that masking is relatively safe, but doesn't receive a strong endorsement, but it may be helpful for some individuals in the management of tinnitus. So in our cricket metaphor analogy, here we have masking. Essentially, we covered up the cricket by presenting another sound or another image to cover up, so it's more difficult to actually see the cricket. Cochlear implants effectively most likely work in the same way that hearing aids do, but obviously providing direct electrical stimulation to provide activity within the cochlear nerve to compete with tinnitus activity, not necessarily at the auditory periphery, but probably through neural stimulation. The evidence for cochlear implants is mixed. There was quite enthusiasm for that in the early 1980s that waned a little bit. Currently, the view is that if individuals have tinnitus, particularly experience tinnitus at a high level prior to implantation, that the implant may be beneficial. If they have low-level tinnitus or no tinnitus at all, of course, the cochlear implant through the operation does carry some risk that tinnitus might emerge afterwards. Normally, individuals will have some suppression when the implant is on, but that is not sustained when the implant is off. Tinnitus retraining therapy came about following the publication of Pavel Jastrebov's 1990 neurophysiological model and combining that with the observations of Jonathan Hazel in the UK that some individuals who used low-level masking seemed to sustain a prolonged reduction in tinnitus that was not reliant on the continued use of masking sound. And by the mid-1990s, this was labeled tinnitus retraining therapy and became fairly widely used amongst the auditory community. And the goal was to essentially aid the habituation to a tinnitus signal. So those individuals who experience bothersome tinnitus could not naturally become used to the tinnitus. They needed to be assisted. One way was by providing instruction and directive counselling to try and reduce the emotional connections to the perception of the sound, essentially disentangling the reaction to tinnitus from its perception. Now, a lot of the argument around tinnitus retraining therapy has been related to the benefit of the sound that is provided above the counselling. Similarly, the counselling that was used was quite often criticised by psychologists as being medically based in a medical model, quite directive and not particularly collaborative. Systematic reviews have tended to find limited evidence. One of the larger studies in this area found that masking in the traditional sense was more beneficial initially after 3 months of therapy, but after 12 to 18 months, tinnitus retraining therapy was superior. Now, what's interesting, I think, is since the mid-1990s, people have modified the tinnitus retraining therapy. Individuals who may claim to be providing tinnitus retraining therapy are not in the pure Jastropoff tinnitus retraining sense, and many have adopted it, incorporating other elements of practice which have been deemed potentially to provide superior effects. A classic example is the use of cognitive behavioral therapy instead of directive therapy. These modified tinnitus retraining therapies have often been investigated under the banner of tinnitus retraining therapy. So it actually blurs the evidence as to what is tinnitus retraining therapy research and what actually is related to other types of therapy that incorporate aspects and principles of tinnitus retraining therapy. So even within some of the reviews, we're really getting quite complicated and understanding what is tinnitus retraining therapy, what is masking therapy, what is in fact sound therapy, and how we define that more generally. So the sound aspect of tinnitus retraining therapy is generally presented at a level that is not masking, because the concept is that if you cover tinnitus, you can no longer habituate to it, although there is in fact some evidence that you can still achieve an habituation effect with total masking. But the idea is that you would reduce the degree to which tinnitus featured within the person's auditory scene to potentially reduce the attention that is devoted to tinnitus and therefore enable a habituation. Now, while Rich Tyler would not call this a modified tinnitus retraining therapy, in 2001, there was a publication called Modified Tinnitus Retraining Therapy, which described the addition of cognitive behavioral therapy to the use of partial masking. This eventually became known as tinnitus activities treatment and has really built on a long history that Rich Tyler has undertaken in the area of clinical tinnitus research, being an early pioneer of partial masking and then incorporating a picture-based counselling process into the auditory rehabilitation area. And this focuses on the areas in which an individual's participation in normal activities is interfered with and tries to target that with counselling using hearing aids and where necessary sound therapy at the lowest effective level, which may vary from individual to individual. It will tend to be at a lower level than total masking and will tend to be at a lower level than mixing as used in tinnitus retraining therapy. But for individuals using the therapy, they may in fact be at an individual level using anywhere along a spectrum from near the threshold of hearing through to total masking, whatever actually works. Now, despite this being widely used, and many hearing aid manufacturers, for example, refer to tinnitus activities. Interestingly, there are no clinical trials of this in its complete nature or systematic reviews that I could find on this particular therapy. Again, analogy, partial masking could be anywhere from total masking to just interfering with the perception of sound. The advantage of using it at a low level is its limited effect on the perception of other sounds and not being annoying in its own right, which can, of course, engage attention and then really affect the individual's ability to adapt to the tinnitus and the combination with the sound. Music is also quite popular, and we need to really differentiate here between music therapy and the use of music as a masker. So music therapy is a psychological therapy in its own right that uses music as a tool, but it's primarily a way of engaging individuals in particular tasks using psychological therapy. So this is going to be undertaken by a music therapist. There's a particular school of music therapy within, particularly in Germany, that has undertaken quite a lot of work within this music area. There is some evidence that the combination of music therapy compared to a single session of counselling is useful, but like most levels of tinnitus evidence, it's not at a level we can have a huge amount of faith in. And this is not unique to this particular sound therapy, as we will see as I go through the talk today. Neuromonics. Now, this is use of music, and of course it was developed in Australia, so shout out to our Australian colleagues for this. It, of course, has changed over time as the technology has developed. Using a combination of music blended with shower sound, essentially a broadband noise, it adjusted music spectrum to accommodate the presence of hearing loss. Initially, it was provided in a device and dispensed, not too dissimilar in the way that we would dispense hearing aids. Now, the US-based company dispenses this as a download to your phone as an app, showing technology change. I know in New Zealand, one of the barriers to the uptake of the Neuromonics treatment was largely based around cost. There is a reasonable amount of research in this area. It has been criticised by independent researchers on the basis that a lot of it was undertaken by the developers themselves, so risks bias. And some work in the United States in the early 2010s suggested that using sound therapy devices, hearing aid type sound therapy devices, provided equal benefit, but a cost benefit basis. The hearing aid devices were slightly cheaper, and so they came out as having slightly greater cost benefit. Fractal sounds can be considered music-like, but they are generated by computer algorithms, and they tend to resemble musical chimes. And many audiologists will be familiar with one of the larger hearing aid companies have made this available in their hearing aids, again, in the late 2000s onward. Most of these trials have been open label, so they haven't been controlled. There are large individual therapy differences between individuals with any of these trials, and consequently, the evidence suggests that they may provide modest improvement. Again, almost all of these trials would be the call out for larger randomized control trials. Likewise, auditory training of various tasks have been used. This is something that we've been involved in the past, looking at perceptual or multisensory training games. Essentially, these are designed to help an individual learn to focus less on their tinnitus and reward them for focusing in on other sounds. Various bases to the therapy and in terms of what the training might be. And the promise in and around these types of therapy is related to gamification and the ability to provide reward and to a certain extent punishment if the individuals listen into their tinnitus. And we know that active training can result in fairly speedy training tasks compared to passive learning, which most sound therapy actually is. Virtual reality has been tried in this area to a certain extent to aid cognitive behavioral therapy, but not with a great success over manual cognitive behavioral therapy. But there are many parameters in this area that can be explored, and we should expect growth in this area moving forward into the future treatments. So in the case of many of these therapies, while we've thought about tinnitus sound therapy blocking the tinnitus sound from a bottom-up process, essentially activity within the auditory nerve traveling up and interfering with activity in the auditory cortex. Really, the picture may be much more complex than that and may be heavily influenced by individual perception and where within the auditory networks tinnitus actually develops. So, for example, hearing aids and more complex sounds that we use to interfere with tinnitus may not be masking in the sense of energetic masking through the use of a sound covering tinnitus as a peripherally generated signal, but rather through providing additional information, and simply our attention is drawn away from the tinnitus onto other activity. So information masking occurs by essentially a depletion of the resources available to pay attention to all the sounds that we want to, and our attention is drawn to what we see as being the most interesting or most important signal. So in some cases of sound therapy, what is actually happening is the sound is probably more interesting and demanding on our perception than the tinnitus itself, and so it takes attention away from the tinnitus and we focus on the new sound. Alternatively, what we might actually get is a situation where the cricket changes and from being an annoying signal into perhaps something more pleasant. Now, this might be an exaggeration here, but we've certainly undertaken work in which we've begun with a tinnitus avatar, a replica of the tinnitus, and over the period of several weeks, we've morphed that from a copy of the tinnitus into something far more benign from an auditory perspective. And we seem to get benefit there. We've seen brain changes, as I'll show you shortly. The exact mechanisms, well, that's something that we have to work out over time. But it's possible that rather than obscuring tinnitus, reducing attention, we can perhaps change the way that the brain is actually processing that. And perhaps this is one neural mechanism behind cognitive behavioral therapy as an example. Now, there are a number of innovative therapies that are currently out there, available in some markets, others more widely available, that measure tinnitus pitch and then apply some sort of therapy based in and around that. Notch noise is probably, or notch music is one of the longest standing examples of this. This came out of work using lateral inhibition, in which a music signal would be notched in and around the tinnitus pitch with the view that the music being a pleasant signal, much in the same way it's used in the Neuromonics treatment, alongside a perceptual notch would enable an inhibitory response on the area of the brain driving pitch-related perception of the tinnitus signal. I personally have a few difficulties with this. One is your ability to accurately pitch match and maintain that pitch match over time. The other relates to the intermittent nature of music signal. And that view extends through to the idea of notched amplification as well, which applies a notch to amplified sound. At the moment, there are some studies looking at a small number of individuals using notched sound approach. Evidence for notched music and effectiveness on tinnitus is not at a high level of evidence. But, we have to accept that a lot of evidence in the tinnitus area is unfortunately very preliminary. There are some other treatments based around proprietary devices. Acoustic coordinate reset neuromodulation was a therapy that came out of Parkinson's research and a group in Germany. It's available in the UK market. Essentially, you use a combination of tones with the idea that it can desynchronize activity, again, driving the pitch perception of tinnitus. The evidence is not strong. One placebo-controlled trial was not published in the UK because of methodological complaints, but that showed no benefit above a control. Likewise, systematic reviews have not provided that the evidence that there's sufficient evidence for recommending this in clinical practice yet. And part of the argument in and around this may in fact be in the selection of patients and the application to particular types of tinnitus. Likewise, in the use of bimodal stimulation, we had some evidence in animals coming out of the United States that if you paired vagus nerve stimulation along with auditory training, those animals that received the vagus nerve stimulation had neural changes learnt much quicker than those animals that did not. So the concept then goes through to humans that if you provide this vagus nerve stimulation along with a pattern tone stimulus, that you should enable a tonotopic reorganization of the cortical map for frequency perception. And this should lead to a diminishing of tone-related tinnitus. Again, some questions here. Is tonotopic reorganization actually the basis of tinnitus in humans, and the extent to which the signal, the auditory signal, is important in this treatment above the vagus nerve stimulation, which in the cases of the Serenity device, which is this top picture here, does require a surgical implant. Another treatment that's received quite a lot of press, and within Ireland in particular, quite a lot of scientific funding, is trigeminal stimulation through a tongue stimulator. There's a little electric pad which is placed on the tongue, and various electrical stimulation patterns are coupled with sound stimulation because, again, trigeminal nerve stimulation either through the tongue or in other basic research through stimulation of the somatosensory system in the neck has been shown to help promote neural plasticity. So the concept here is you use the tongue stimulator along with a period of auditory stimulation over time. These treatments are both fairly new, and my question would be moving forward again as to what extent the sound stimulation is separate from the tongue stimulation. One trial that's been released showed that different tongue pattern stimulation really did not differentiate significant effects of the sound stimulation. So that ultimately will determine whether stimulating the trigeminal nerve has any benefit above sound stimulation alone. So if we're looking at this analogy, those treatments that are trying to eliminate the tinnitus, which is the basis really of the bimodal stimulation, it's not about changing the person's perception of, the person's interpretation or reaction to tinnitus. It's really trying to reduce tinnitus sound, is trying to eliminate, remove the sound, or at least reduce it. And ultimately, that is what people would really like. We would like the tinnitus to actually go. My feeling is in current strategies, use of that alone without considering the psychological domain of tinnitus may be unsuccessful in the majority of patients that we actually see. And I'll get on to why at the moment. So we potentially have a topology for sound therapy. It's not a simple construct at all. And this is where I have a little bit of a problem with systematic reviews of tinnitus sound therapy. And it's essentially lumped in altogether. There's no differentiation between different approaches to how sound is actually working. And if we break this down, simply we can talk about the presence of sound. We look at the presence of sound, that may be methodologies such as masking, reducing auditory gain, residual inhibition, which appears to be a suppression of nerve firing following a loud sound, potentially desynchronization, potentially lateral inhibition, and potentially changing in the noise reducing processes of the brain, possibly through auditory gating. You note there that there are lots of possibilities and maybes in this. It's not definitive. If we look at the processes, the presence of sound effect is largely a bottom-up, sound-driven effect. If we look at the context of sound, we're looking more at complex patterns, and this is higher level top-down processes requiring some thought, higher level cognition, rather than being primitive pattern-based, which the previous mechanism is. It requires schema or learnt perceptions to come into play. It's based on knowledge and experiences for the effect of sound on tinnitus, and it involves predicting and interpreting patterns rather than a passive procedure. Now, sound therapy through this may achieve that through informational masking, simply the level of attention required to process the sound and the tinnitus. It may occur through some form of reorganization, either from a tonal perspective, or I think more widely a neural network perspective, and of course, potentially training attention from away from the tinnitus, whereby an individual becomes very good at attending to the tinnitus, onto more natural environments and sound in their real world. Another way that sound may have an effect, and of course sounds may have the effect through multiple aspects of this pyramid, from present to context to reaction. But a reaction effect, if you can would be seen as the classical effect of listening music to provide relaxation. You may not necessarily, in fact, be targeting the tinnitus sound, but you may be reducing the emotional response to the tinnitus by generally providing some level of stress, relaxation, and improving the mood of the individual. But in the past, really, people have not differentiated the mechanisms of sound therapy in any meaningful way and attempting to dissect the mechanisms. And it's very possible that for a given individual, any one of these potential mechanisms may be more important than another. And I can't say which mechanism will work for any given individual at this point in time, but I do think that that's potentially where we are moving in the future. Ideally, we get to the point from these present treatments where an individual would have complete adaptation to the tinnitus. Now, I don't call this necessarily habituation because adaptation may be a number of different mechanisms. On this side, on the left-hand side of the figure here, we have Jastrabov's neurophysiological model and the connections between the auditory system and the limbic system and perception and reaction to the underlying tinnitus signal, and the fact that this becomes a feedback loop in individuals that are bothered by tinnitus. So what might be an innocuous signal becomes overemphasized and it becomes a problem. Now, in tinnitus retraining therapy, habituation, which is a very basic form of learning, the most basic form of learning process that there is, which is basically a passive exposure and becoming used to something simply because of its omnipresence, can lead to a habituation of reaction. This is what we would normally see in clinic, and this is, of course, where counselling will often target. That's to reduce abnormal reactions to the tinnitus perception. If the person was unable to perceive the tinnitus for a majority of time, or it was to fade from consciousness, that is, they would have to effectively attend to the tinnitus, this would be an activity related to habituation of perception. But habituation may not be the mechanism, and it may in fact be explained, for example, through signal detection theory, which is on the right-hand side here. And in this theory, which is shared by one of my colleagues here at the University of Auckland and was developed out of a longitudinal study at Dunedin from the Dunedin longitudinal study, was the basis that perhaps tinnitus is represented by an underlying signal, but we all have a particular signal detection criteria that we apply. So this is something that we apply. It may be based on personality to a certain extent. It may be modifiable. We can potentially modify tinnitus perception by directly affecting the underlying tinnitus signal. That is, we move the signal below the criteria for perception of that individual. Or alternatively, the signal underlying tinnitus does not change, but our criteria for whether it is present or not may in fact change. So it may be possible in two different ways. This might be a physiological change, perhaps by some tinnitus targeting pharmacotherapy. This might be achieved more through learning, perhaps sound therapy, perhaps through psychological interventions. So, tinnitus, I realize we're coming out of time pretty quickly, so I'm going to run through this quickly, largely because I'm speculating on the future. It is possible because the details in and around this are obviously scant. Just a word around pharmacotherapy. Autonomy is a company that out of California that I'm doing a little bit of work with, and they have undertaken early pilot studies using an MDA antagonist, which is inserted into the middle ear in a gel. And they have found, compared to a placebo, reasonably strong effects in reducing tinnitus according to the tinnitus functional index. And so we can see a reasonably high proportion of people receiving the active constituent noticed a clinically meaningful change in tinnitus compared to a placebo. So the potential of pharmacotherapy, particularly as in this case in acute patients, I think is quite highly likely. Again, our ability to identify individuals who may get most benefit from others that won't. This is just individual data from 3 different studies in response to hearing aids and sound therapy. And what we can see is people below the line, if they're below the line, they improved with the therapy. What we see is, a wide scatter of individual results. we do see some individuals that respond really strongly. And the argument would be is why? What is it about these individuals that are different from other individuals in these particular research studies? And wouldn't it be cool if we could identify why they changed and then provide a therapy for them? These other people might receive a different therapy. So if we go back to the present therapies that I've mentioned, whether it be multisensory stimulation, whether it be masking, tinnitus retraining therapy, all of these may be beneficial for some ideal candidates, but they may not work ideally for others. If we could identify those people that would benefit most from a particular approach, we would streamline clinical management of tinnitus in a really useful way. We might be able to identify those people for whom drug therapy might work, for whom psychotherapy might be necessary, for whom sound therapy might work best. Some work by colleagues that are potentially listening to this talk here from the University of Otago offers strong promise in this area, in which if you are to take blood from a group of individuals with tinnitus and a group of control participants and look for metabolic markers in the blood, you can potentially differentiate the two groups. Although at an early stage here, what we can see is a tinnitus group blue, control group green, and we can see some separation between these groups on the basis of whether they have tinnitus or not. And of course, ultimately, if you become even more discriminating and be able to tell the physiological basis for individual differences, you begin to potentially very effectively identify targets for personalised training. And Yiwen and Paul might like to talk about some of this work in a future one of these evening seminars. I want to briefly, really quickly, talk about tinnitus as a neural network disorder. And this is really where most of my research emphasis has been in some way recently, and is certainly being tailored by the results that we're seeing and is having a focus in this area. So the idea here is that there is no one single target for tinnitus therapy. If essentially you target a particular brain-related mechanism of tinnitus, then another part of a tinnitus network may take over and drive perception in a different way. And all of the therapies that I've talked about, whether it be cognitive behavioral therapy or masking, target one aspect of this neural network. Perhaps what we need to do is develop therapies or a combination of therapies that, that essentially identify and work on those potentially important parts of a neural network for an individual. And that may require action against the default mode network, auditory perception, the limbic system, attention, and even, interestingly, visual networks. Now, how have we been aided in this process? And great thanks goes out to the bioinformatics team at AUT University, one of the other universities here in Auckland, and Miriam and Zori, who have been working with me looking at using artificial neural networks and understanding brain processes. And we've been applying this to behavioral data, but what I wanted to show you is some of the results from EEG data, and I'll also mention some MRI data that we have looked at brain networks as well. So we're able to record brain activity. We've generally done that in the resting state. So this is just spontaneous activity that's occurring. And what we obviously want to do is try and identify tinnitus-related activity. And what we're tending to do is look at individuals before and after an intervention. So we're looking at individual changes with different interventions to see whether the modeling of spiking neural networks and its representation in an anatomically correct brain model of the neural system and a recording of EEG can in some way reflect patterns of activity that would enable us to, one, identify regions of the brain that might be important in tinnitus, and two, predict those individuals that may benefit from a therapy simply looking at the EEG at resting state before we provide any intervention. So this is an example of the new cube. What it looks at is essentially the timing, the spatial temporal characteristics of electrical activity underlying an electrode spaced on the brain from a spatial point of view, but looking at it over time as well. And then through this mathematical modeling, we're able to see differences across time. And what we've been interested in is before and after therapy. So here we've got two studies looking at after auditory residual inhibition. So a broadband masking sound. This is traditional Loretta imaging of EEG activity. The hot areas indicating increased activity, the blue areas indicating decreased activity during suppression of tinnitus following a broadband sound, showing frontal and temporal regions being activated. A separate study using the new cube neural network model, again, identifying similar areas of activity. Potentially, what we might be saying here is that these areas of frontal and temporal lobe are contributing or being activated, deactivated by sound therapy in individuals when we're applying this particular approach. So not necessarily all the areas that are driving tinnitus perception and reaction, but some of them. If we look at the use of amplitude modulated sound, the difference there seems to be incorporation of parts of the brain that are more involved in pattern perception. If we look at longer term use of a sound therapy that incorporates spatial characteristics, then we get changes in activity that incorporate the occipital parietal area. So we've got perception and also activity that we would normally perhaps associate with visual activity, which has been shown as being important as part of a resting neural network for tinnitus in several studies. This is not a tinnitus study, but it's from a couple of the team looking at mindfulness. And again, we might expect that mindfulness for depression would have a similar effect on mindfulness for tinnitus, showing activity changed in frontal, central, temporal regions and also occipital regions. Here, perhaps affecting a broadly distributed network representing some of the tinnitus-related generation and perception, but not all of the network. The sound morphing, which I talked about before, where a sound starts off as a copy of the tinnitus and over time changes to something that sounds quite different from it, seems to show patterns of activity related to changes at level of the amygdala, but also, again, pattern perception, less so the auditory, primary auditory cortex, but also occipital visual regions. A study looking at MRI, these are MRI results and relationship between particular areas of the brain before and after a perceptual multisensory training game, showed changes in interconnections between quite a distributed network there. Again, different from some of the other studies. Auditory cortex, visual cortex, perceptual network, but also parts of the brain that are heavily involved as part of attention and emotion perception. So where we are at the moment, and we're currently undertaking a pilot study, is an app that incorporates headphones, and we are looking at various forms of training based on a number of those different elements, with the belief that the sum of the treatments will be able to be personalised for individuals. At the moment, on the basis of self-report, essentially information that they provide, but using artificial intelligence, the system will become smarter, so we will be able to predict who will benefit from a particular part of the treatment and who won't. Ultimately, we'll incorporate sensors. Already, our preliminary results using EEG suggest that from the EEG results, we're able to predict within a 90 to 100% sort of band those individuals who will or won't benefit from sound therapy. Ultimately, we want to improve the resolution there so that we can get an individual in the clinic, do an EEG, that will predict what sort of therapy will most benefit from that individual, and that can be implemented through, for example, an app-based system. Ultimately, what we would really like to be able to do is to get that happening in real time, perhaps where we have an EEG headset incorporated working, so that as an individual with tinnitus moves through their daily life, we are able to gather the information, look at real time changes in tinnitus related activity, and then the therapy can respond to that in real time and change its response as an individual's response changes. So this becomes a very personalized system. I realize that I've gone over time, so I should stop talking now. I'd like to thank the team that have been involved in this research. Roger Boulder, who is very helpful in the development of the tinnitus-related app that we're trialling at the moment. Phil Sanders, who is trialling the app as the research fellow, but is also looking to begin work in the area of augmented reality and virtual reality to enhance some of our training. Dunja Vasovic, who is involved in a new form of the morphing therapy that I mentioned, and Zore Dobroje, who is one of the parts of the team based at the University of Auckland in collaboration with her sister based at the Auckland University of Technology, working in the area of artificial intelligence. And these are the various funders. We probably don't have time for lots of questions, but we welcome you providing some feedback through the comments section. And I suppose moving forward more broadly, we will be hopefully surveying you about the sorts of talks that you would like to hear, the time of day, given that we potentially want to reach a diverse audience, particularly Australia and New Zealand. And so it may not be particularly favourable for our international group, but we do want to reach out to as many people as we possibly can. And we welcome suggestions for talks. We think that, a sort of a mixture of talks from a basic science perspective and then clinic research, but perhaps some very clinic focused practical aspects would really be useful, and hopefully address some gaps that we think in the Indo-Pacific. I hear that's the political term that we should be using for our geographic spacing at the moment. The Indo-Pacific region, perhaps we haven't had in the past. The knowledge has been here, but we really haven't tapped into that. So Alicia and Mike, do you, as the other sort of organisers, do you have any comments that you would like to add? Because I've probably outstayed my welcome with regards to talking.
No, thank you for a great talk, Grant. It was really great. Welcome everyone. So as Grant said, the idea of having this group is to actually have more discussions and talks, not only about research, but also about services and struggles. We conducted a study in Australia with audiologists about tinnitus and tinnitus services. And one of the kind of very loud message which came out of this was that clinicians and audiologists would love to have an opportunity, more opportunities to discuss what we can do in, what's happening in tinnitus research, what we can do, when working with patients who suffer from tinnitus. And so I think in the future, that was the opening talk given by Grant. But I think in the future, we also, as he said, Grant will have a talk and also more opportunity for discussions. I personally will be really interested what brought every one of you to this meeting, what you are interested in. And as Grant said, there'll be short surveys sent about it, what would be the best way, how we can work together. Welcome to people. We had Billy Martin from Singapore. We have Carolina from Manchester. So I think we're covering lots of different parts of the world. Thank you for being with us. And I think, I don't know, Mike, anything to add?
No, that's great. Thank you both. Just a small one to add, which is that the nature of Grant's talk is kind of it requires a little bit of opinion. So thank you, Grant, for maybe going out on a limb and that, because that's the kind of thing that that might stimulate useful sort of discussions. And it's futurology is always an inexact science, but it's a very comprehensive overview. Difficult to find those sorts of that sort of information together in one place concisely. So thanks, Grant, and I hope that we can build on that moving forward.
Great. Yeah, I think that we all have to sort of acknowledge that tinnitus science is somewhat incomplete, and also that there are very strong opinions one way or another in this particular area. And I hope that this can be a forum where we share in a way that is open, non-exclusive. It's, of course, respectful for everybody's opportunities, but I think that we do not want to limit the discussion. And, as you mentioned, Alicia, perhaps one of the great opportunities afforded by the different technologies that we have available to us is the ability to have online fora and talk about different things. And by making sure that my talk was too long, I limited the opportunity for discussion so I wouldn't be too heavily interrogated on what I said. But I think that we welcome all sorts of discussion and really do hope that people will be encouraged to join this. And it is fantastic that people have been able to join during their workday or in their evenings, some people very late at night. And, that's fantastic. We greatly appreciate that. And so we do want to be able to see how we can incorporate that. This talk is being recorded. We will make it available. So if you do want to spread this amongst other people that you think will benefit, that's fantastic. There may be talkers that, for various reasons, do not want their talk recorded because of potentially some findings that they would like to publish, and presentation may interfere with that. But that shouldn't prevent us from inviting them to present and hearing from them and so on. I don't want to keep people any further. I'd love to hear people's feedback. I'd love to have a conversation about what I talked about. I'm looking forward to hearing from Mike to hear what he thought might perhaps have been the slightly more controversial aspects of the talk, or the more thought-provoking aspects of that, and very much welcome that. Yeah, there we go. So I welcome that from everybody, and whether you want to do that, through this group or through individual emails, I'd like to thank you all very much, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening, good rest of the day, or a very pleasant sleep for those going to head off to bed. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll sign off. We look forward to hearing from everybody. Thank you very much.